In order for us to preserve and embrace our identity as Filipinos, we should first understand our literary, artistic, and cultural heritage. This includes historical events that transformed and awakened our Filipino spirit and patriotism.
Maayong adlaw. Charles Dominic Sanchez here of the Cebuano Study Center, inviting you to the Vicente Soto Lecture Series where we feature a host of writers, artists, academics, and experts from various other fields to impart their knowledge of Cebuano art, literature, history, and culture in general onto us. Not only will you learn some stuff about our province's rich past, but you'll also come to appreciate how you yourself are a result of that past.
This series is named after the late Don Vicente Soto, who was regarded as the father of Cebuano language and letters. He published not only the first newspaper in Cebuano, Ang Suga, in the 1900s, but also published the first Cebuano short story, Maming. He also wrote and directed the first Cebuano realist drama. He was a man of protean accomplishments, a prolific writer and publisher, a renowned lawyer, and a pioneering labor leader who left his own personal mark in the practice of Philippine politics and culture.
Hopefully, you'll walk away from these lectures not just with mere factoids and tidbits of trivia, but also the necessary knowledge connections that will enable you to look at the world differently in a way that helps contribute to a better tomorrow for the generations yet to come. Daghang salamat. Ladies and gentlemen, please make yourselves comfortable. I'd like to remind everyone once again to please keep your mics on mute to avoid any audio disruptions in the course of the program. And also equally important, kindly do not forget to answer the evaluation form before the program ends. A link to this form will be repeatedly posted in the chat box by one of our literature majors, Irene Dayao. Once you've submitted your form, you can expect your electronic certificate of participation to be sent to you in a few days' time. Thank you. Now let us begin our program with an opening prayer to be led by third year literature student Ara Grace Ortega. This will be followed by the singing of the national anthem.
Let us put ourselves in the holy presence of God, my Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Almighty God, we praise and thank you for this day. You have given us another opportunity to appreciate life and to fulfill our mission as your instruments of peace and progress. Please pardon us for our shortcomings. Lord, bless all our endeavors, especially today's lecture. Guide us in our discussions and enlighten our minds in every decision that we make. Give us your grace that we may effectively do our parts as listeners and speakers. Bless our studies, plans, and projects so that we may achieve our objectives for your greater glory. Amen.
Maayong hapon kanatong tanan. This is your host, Charles Dominic Sanchez of the University of San Carlos Cebuano Study Center. And I would like to welcome you all to the third Vicente Soto lecture series for this year. Now, just a quick recap for those who are just joining us. For our first installment this year, back in January 2021, we had Dr. Cristina Juan of the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London give us a lecture on the documentation on Cebu that she was able to find in the British archives. Following that, last month, we had Dr. Jose Elizar Jobers Bersales deliver a similar lecture, this time on select Cebu documents he found in the Augustinian archives in Spain. Before we get into this month's lecture, though, which I'm sure you're all eager to listen to, let us formally open the program with some words from the series organizer herself. Dear audience members, please give a warm virtual applause for the Deputy Director of the Cebuano Study Center and newly minted PhD, Dr. Bea Yap Martinez.
Good morning to our speakers, Mr. Dennis Hodilla and Mr. Nino Loyola, and to all our participants. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the third installment of our lecture series this year, organized by the Cebuano Studies Center of the University of San Carlos. The Cebuano Studies Center is a center of research on all aspects of Cebuano culture. It functions as a special library to house source materials pertaining to Cebu, as well as the predominantly Cebuano-speaking areas in the country. It also functions as a research center devoted to studies pertaining to Cebu in the area of the humanities and social sciences, and as a special office assisting in the promotion of Cebuano culture and the arts. The Cebuano Studies Center has become an active instrument in encouraging and supporting research activities within the university in the areas of the social sciences and the humanities. In addition, it has become a model of its kind as a local regional research center in the country through its varied activities in the conduct and promotion of local regional studies. The Vicente Soto Lecture Series is one avenue by which we do this. This monthly lecture series, which ran many years ago, has been revived under the direction of Dr. Hope Yu, with the goal of adding to the discussions on Cebuano culture, arts, and history. With these lectures, we hope to make the rich cultural heritage of Cebu more visible to the bigger public, and we hope to create venues where the public can join in the discussions with renowned researchers and experts in the field of Cebuano studies. Since reviving the Vicente Soto Lecture Series, we have heard from 6 esteemed researchers who discuss different aspects of our history, culture, and local traditions. Today, we will be hearing from Mr. Dennis Hudilia, whose lecture is entitled Dato Lapu-Lapu, a Cinematic Character Study. I am specifically looking forward to today's lecture, which will explore the key figure of Dato Lapu-Lapu and his heroic depictions in visual and screen media, and will also touch on his historical presence and his characterization in the historical fiction of Vicente Gullias and Sofronio Ursal. The lectures we bring to you serve as acts of cultural production, which also serve as a means of boosting cultural identity. Whether tangible or intangible, culture plays a key role in reinforcing identity, binding together a community, and diversifying our national identity. It is in this spirit that the Vicente Soto Lecture Series has taken shape. So on behalf of the Cebuano Studies Center, I welcome you all today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bea, for those welcoming remarks. And thank you also for all the effort you've put into organizing this lecture series. From finding speakers to setting up the registration, it actually takes a lot of work, and we wouldn't be here today without you doing what you do. Now that we've officially opened the program, let's move on to our first speaker for today, who will share with us what he's learned on the last few years of Vicente Soto's much celebrated career. Our first speaker is a literature teacher at the University of San Carlos and also a creative writer, who works part-time in literary and technical translation. His short stories and poetry have been published in Bisaya Magazine, and in 2017 he was one of the recipients of the 15th Jimmy Balakwit Literary Awards and the Labing Masaarong Bagong Magsusulat sa Bisaya. Audience members, it is my honor to introduce a colleague at the university, a very good friend, and also a Pokemon and Lego enthusiast, Mr. Nino Agustin Loyola. A warm virtual round of applause, please.
Thank you for having me, Charles. So, yeah, I hope the audio connection is okay. And yeah, without further ado, let me share the screen to briefly discuss to you the last few years of Vicente Soto. So, yeah, give me a second here to share the screen. Okay, yeah, I hope you can see the presentation on the screen now. So yeah, I basically just call this the Mavericks final years. No, it's all taken from the last chapter before the epilogue of Dr. Resil Mojares' biography of Soto, Vicente Soto, the Maverick Senator, published in 1992. So yeah, I placed this photo here of Vicente Soto because what I remembered was like last year and 1 year and 1 month ago, the very first lecture series, which was held in USC downtown campus. The speaker said no, emphasized that Vicente Soto kanang Bisaya mo to niya walay way hadlok wa isog kayo na siya nga magsulat. He knows no fear. He really upholds the truth. So yeah, that's actually the quality and the virtue that I really admire when it comes to Vicente Soto. So it is actually emphasized in this chapter. So the last few years would be this chapter in the book actually started in 1947. We all know that he passed away in 1950, May 28, 1950. So the first part talks about his second tour to the world. So June 3rd, 1947, on board SS President Polk, he shared a cabin with former U.S. technical advisor, Governor General Francis Burton Harrison. And it's worth knowing that Harrison was actually the one who he was actually the one who trying to remember the he was the one who pardoned Soto when he was in prison. So surprisingly, they shared a cabin on that boat, and yeah, they actually became good friends because of that. So yes, this is the second tour, and he has been to this place before. So he actually revisited Cairo, Naples, Genoa, Paris, and this is actually both for leisure and for work purposes. Since he was also a UN diplomat, he observed a session at the House of Commons in London, and then spoke at the National Press Club in San Francisco, and participated in the deliberations of the UN General Assembly in New York City that year. And so from June to December, it was that's the duration of his world tour. So, but on the 4th of September that year, he was appointed by Manuel Rojas as the Philippine representative to the second regular session of the UN General Assembly. So that's why he was able to participate in the General Assembly that year. And then, yeah, furthermore, on November 20, he drafted a resolution to impose conditions on Germany and Japan on their respective peace treaties with the allied nations to remove these countries as a threat to further peace. You know that this is like a year after the war, and after the year after the official surrender of Germany, Germany and Japan. And what actually happened is that to further prevent these countries from initiating a war, they were demilitarized by the UN, and but Soto proposed to so yeah, it's still there. No, under the tutelage of UN, their government will be they would have their own government, but it will be assessed and it will be under the guidance of UN. But most importantly, remove these countries as a threat. But apparently, the Philippine delegation declined to present Soto's belligerent proposals. So he went back to the Philippines on December the 10th and wrote a book, My Second Travel Around the World. So we actually had a memoir. And this is published in Benipayo Press in 1948. Actually, I haven't seen a copy of this book yet, but it would be good to read this now. So yeah, the next part is in Philippine politics and also his health. And just a side note that when you read the book, the first actually the first chapter there's no chapter numbers in the book, but when you read Vicente Soto, the Maverick Senator, um, there's just the names of the parts or the chapters. And the first part actually talks about what are the events that happened after his death, and then it then continued on with the day of his birth, and then so on, and then up to the last years, and then the epilogue. So yeah, to continue, on April the 15th, 1948, this was the time when Rojas died due to heart attack. So it's worth knowing when I talk about these key points, although it would be better no if you read the book, but I'm just talking on the key points here. There's still a lot of things that a lot of details that are actually worth knowing about the politics during this time. So yeah, Rojas died due to heart attack, and when he was delivering a speech in Clark Field in Pampanga. So the next president, the vice president at that time, Elpidio Quirino, assumed office and declared that he was interested in having a system with the likes of a coalition government. And this is where it actually gets political. No, I remembered when I was trying to consolidate the information here, I had to message Charles Sanchez to talk about the relation of coalition government during this time. But I remember that this was also the start of the conflict and of Stalin, no, the early years of Cold War when communism was on the rise. So yeah, that's what it was about the coalition government. And being a liberal, although it's also worth knowing that Soto is actually the original political party of Soto was called the Frente Popular, or that's the Spanish word for Popular Front. Soto opposed this as it undermines the principle of party rule and responsibility, being a predecessor to an oligarchy, and also totalitarianism by the likes of Mussolini, Hitler, even Stalin. And also with this, Soto also opposed the appointment of Nacionalista leader Jose P. Laurel to a secretary of Interior post due to being a quote-unquote collaborator, as in the rise of communism in the Cold War. In August 1948, that's almost an entire month, he was diagnosed with myelogenous leukemia. I believe it's cancer in the blood. And yeah, stayed almost an entire month at the hospital. And yeah, on this period, it's also indicated there by Dr. Mojares that yeah, if you read the biography of Soto, he's actually not a Catholic, but he is Aglipayan. It almost looks like Catholic. No, they have priests, they have churches, but it's a whole. It's like an offshoot of Catholicism. Although while he was in the hospital and he was there with his cousin Angel Soto, Angel or Angel Soto, he saw the chart, and the religion there was actually placed as Catholic. But so yeah, he actually insisted to change it and just change it to, it's not Aglipayan he wanted to put there, but Pensador Libre, or Libre Pensador, or free thinker. That's the Spanish word for free thinker. So so yeah, he didn't consider himself a Catholic. So yeah, as his health was failing, his antagonism also sharpened. I don't know how else to describe this, but you know, he's old during this time. Maybe you know, an old man being an old man. Maybe it's just my personal hypothesis, but maybe he's like a he's like a grumpy old man during this time. No, but yeah, his antagonism sharpened. No, he criticized, for example, he criticized the proliferation of Western jazz on the radio, criticized the use of Tagalog in use among Cebuano-speaking areas, chided or called out his colleagues in Congress for wearing polo shirts, army suntans, and the barong, as he claimed it was an anti-Filipino concoction of the Spanish period. Why? Because it's made for Filipinos to identify that they're Filipinos, so they're like inferior. It suggests inferiority. And yeah, he actually engaged in a feud in November 1948 to January next year. Yeah, engaged in a feud where he called out the Supreme Court for punishing reporter Angel Parazo for not providing source of a news report, criticized the erroneously interpreting the press freedom law, which he authored. You know that the Soto Act or the Republic Act 1953 is the press freedom law. No, until now, it's still there, but it's very important to know that Vicente Soto actually made this law in the government, which is to protect the journalists and to make them safe from not divulging their sources. I believe that's the main idea of that law. So he threatened to reorganize the Supreme Court because of this, but was sent with a notice of contempt. And he said that he will be sent to prison again. He said that if he will be sent to prison again, he will just write his next book, My Sixth Visit to the Penitentiary. So yeah, I will just bring a typewriter there and go on and write his next book. So then again, it's like it is a win-win scenario for him. So eventually, in January the 21st that year, 1949, Soto was cited for contempt. So nadayon gyud. Sentenced to pay 1,000 pesos and asked to show cause why he should not be disbarred. This is penned by Justice Gregorio Perfecto. He is a Democracia turned nationalista. So Perfecto brought up Soto's previous cases, but was also questioned by Soto for his ethics and competence, and was denounced by Soto for his partisanship, delivering anti-administration speeches, dishonesty, and unethical and corrupt practices. So on 3 days after, Perfecto was impeached for abusive language in indicting Soto for contempt. So it actually turned the other way around. So Soto actually gained the upper hand and convinced them to impeach Perfecto. So the things omitted by Perfecto, Soto made it clear that he was pardoned in his 1907 abduction case, that libel case he also faced, and the disbarment case was lifted when new evidence was provided to the High Court. So this was actually cases that were resolved, but Justice Perfecto never mentioned that. So even if Soto expressed his intent to be Quirino's running mate at the next elections, apparently there was a plan to make him to run as vice president. But apparently he allied with Senate President Jose Avellino, who was in a months-long feud with Quirino, in which Soto's health was in poor condition at around these times. So sessions were boycotted by Avellino and his allies after he was replaced by Mariano Jesus Cuenco as acting Senate President. So Quirino during this time actually had 2 terms technically. When he replaced Rojas, and during his actual term when he won the elections the elections that year. On March 31st, Soto left for US for treatment under radiation therapy, and was also appointed by Quirino as a Philippine delegate in the UN General Assembly. Although they're not really that close, but they're not also enemies. But Quirino, it's like by default that Soto was appointed as the delegate for the Philippines that year. So he went back to the Philippines in June 1949 for the elections in November. So he said that he doesn't want to miss the elections. So, but the election had three parties: the Liberal Party under the Avellino wing, Liberal Party Quirino wing, and the actual opponent Nacionalista Party ticket of Laurel and Manuel Briones. So during the elections, although not involved in the campaign, Soto was active in the press in opposing Laurel and propagated his anti-collaboration sentiments. Meanwhile, in Batangas, the hometown of President-elect Quirino, a rebel uprising in different areas of the town broke out. Actually, we all know that he won during the elections, but Dr. Mojares actually quoted that it was the dirtiest elections in the Philippine history. Apparently, the results were actually rigged. So Laurel was accused, but no evidence was found. Soto wrote and referred to this as a response to an electoral fraud and a probable cause of a revolt or civil war due to Quirino's questionable victory. Manila Times reporter Luis Serrano claimed that Soto was involved in the Batangas uprising, as there have been verified accounts that Laurel, Avellino, and other prominent politicians meeting secretly to prevent Quirino's presidential proclamation. Although, the way Dr. Mojares said this, it's more than an allegation. It's almost true because it actually happened, and it's not how do you say this? It's not far from the truth that Soto was also there. So on the results, what actually happened after the elections on December the 13th, Philippine Congress met in a joint session with the senators to canvass the election results and its winners. So but 3 weeks prior to the session, the Nacionalista Party, the party of Laurel and the Avellino wing, signed a pact to oppose Quirino's proclamation. It's under the pretense that the election was actually rigged. However, in secret meetings held in the Union Club in Quezon City, the Quirino and Avellino blocs made a deal to preserve peace, and the trade-off here is to reinstate Avellino to the Senate presidency. Thus, Avellino abandoned their pact with Nacionalistas. So very political, and so there are actually a change of sides here. But Senators Vicente Soto and pro tempore Arans broke away from the party where they allied. Arans resigned from the LP and shifted to the Nacionalista Party. And Soto simply reasoned that he does not want to be a party to the political conspiracy against the Filipinos. So during this session, he gave a speech and made a reference to the Batangas revolt. So around that hometown, Quirino's hometown, and the defiance of the people against oppression. Soto then convinced his colleagues to vote against the resolution but failed. 13 senators and 53 congressmen voted for proclamation for the victory of Quirino. Only 6 senators, including Soto and Arans, and 18 congressmen voted against them. So during an interview after the session, he was asked why he chose sides, and he simply said, "I could not in conscience do it. A person may do bad things in his youth and still do worse things in middle age, but his old age, he should be good. The last chapter of his life should be a good one, not a black page. I have only a few more years to live, and I have decided to live them out honestly." On May the 28th, on 1:07 p.m. at the University of Santo Tomas Hospital, Soto died due to leukemia. That was 5.5 months after his speech at the legislative building. Actually, this part I've mentioned earlier that this was actually taken on the first chapter of the book because it recounted the events after his death. And it's also worth knowing that Soto requested on his death to have a simple service. His grave is actually not that extravagant. That's actually what he wanted, but during the how do you call it that before he was buried, those days before he was buried, it was actually ceremonial because there was still like there was a service done in Manila, and then his body was shipped to Cebu, and then in Cebu there was also a service done, which was visited by Cebuano politicians, also celebrities, and also ordinary Cebuano people, until he was laid to rest in a public cemetery. So if you know, I'm sure you know, you're familiar with Cebu Memorial Park or Sem Park. That is where he was buried. Now, no, personally, I've been there because I had a friend who who had a family member who was buried in Sem Park as well, and she keeps on visiting there. And then she told me she knew where Vicente Soto was laid to rest, or where he was placed. And we went there real quick, and we actually saw his site there, and it like what he requested. It's not really extravagant, although he was together with his deceased family members on that lot, but it's just there. It's just along the road, and like the all the other graves is not. Mas nindot pa tong uban nga kanang naagi masuliyom na katong ang mahalon ang bato gigamit, or napay ka ng design iya kay kuan lang gid naarang nga to kanang simple lang nga lapid so maybe after the pandemic, or if you get vaccinated and you can already go out, maybe you also know, if you know where Sem Park is, you can pay your respects to our great senator there, and then pay your respect there. It's just there. No, he can be found there. So that's the end of my brief discussion. So I hope you're able to learn from it. So thank you for listening, and we'll be proceeding this time to the main talk led by Mr. Hudilia. So thank you.
So thank you for that very informative discussion, Nino, on the twilight years of Vicente Soto's life. I'm sure that as a creative writer and in Cebuano yourself, you owe a great deal to this man whom we've all come to recognize as the father of Cebuano literature, and also the author or purveyor of several opinions that have come to influence us today. Before we let you go, though, Nino, we at the center would like to thank you for conducting the necessary research and taking the time to share with us your knowledge on Vicente Soto. So allow me to read the text of this certificate of appreciation. The University of San Carlos Cebuano Studies Center presents this certificate of appreciation to Nino Agustin M. Loyola for his lecture entitled The Mavericks Final Years during the Vicente Soto Lecture Series 2021, given this 27th day of March 2021 via Zoom. Signed by Father Jesuraj Antoniapen, Vice President for Academic Affairs, and Dr. Hope Sabanpanyu, Director of the Cebuano Studies Center. So thank you, Nino.
Thank you so much,
Virtual round of
Charles.
applause, please.
Thank you, Charles.
So yeah, once again, daghang salamat ninyo. We look forward to more of your writing in the future. And hopefully you'll prove to be just as prolific as Vicente Soto himself. And now we've reached the most awaited part of our program. But before we get to that, though, I just like to take a second to remind everyone once again to fill out the evaluation form once its link is up in the chat box. And once you've accomplished and submitted the evaluation, we will send to you in a couple of days your certificate of participation. Also, if any of you audience members have any questions for today's speaker, do feel free to type them in the chat box for Irene to take note of, and we will try to address as many of these as possible during the open forum after the lecture proper. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for this third installment of the Vicente Soto Lecture Series 2021. So our speaker for today is a creative writer and a creative and corporate writer based in Cebu. He has been involved as a screenwriter and creative consultant in several award-winning Cebuano movie productions such as My Paranormal Romance, Sarang May Tutor, Abot Kamay, and Handuraw sa Kahilitan. He is also the creative director of Cinebuano, Cebu's independent movie making scene, and is involved in local activities that aim to promote and produce Cebuano cinema, culture, and the arts. Currently, he is a senior faculty member of the Fine Arts program in cinema at the University of San Carlos School of Architecture, Fine Arts, and Design, where he teaches screenwriting, producing, production management, and thesis project, among other subjects, while also completing his Master in Arts in Cinema Studies thesis entitled Filipino Melodrama Cinema and Its Tropes as Symptoms of Lacanian Neurosis. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm virtual round of applause, please, to Mr. Dennis Hodilia.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Hello, Charles. Is my audio okay?
Yes, sir, Dennis. We can hear you.
Okay. So welcome. Good afternoon. So please allow me to share my screen. So I hope everyone can see my screen. I'll be presenting my lecture, Datu Lapu-Lapu, a cinematic character study. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the following. I'd like to thank the USC Studies Cebuano Center, particularly Dr. Hope Sabampan-Yu and Dr. Bea Yap Martinez for the invitation and the opportunity to deliver this talk and to be part of the esteemed Vicente Soto series. I also like to thank Ma'am Marie Rose Lapad and Narcisa Michon of the Bump Gardner Learning Resource Center, whose kind assistance have helped me procure the text references that have made my lecture substantial. And also I would like to thank Ma'am Centina Bernil of UC Press also for her kind assistance. So to begin, everyone, I just wanted to show you like the breakup of the lecture. So it has 6 parts. So first, in studying the character of Lapu-Lapu, how he is depicted in cinema, we will first have to have some historical context, and then we will explore how he is expressed or how he's described in literature, especially in Cebuano literature. And then we will also explore his image as visualized by many artists throughout the years, many of which are also national artists in the Philippines through avatars of art. And then just to give us a sort of criteria on how we are going to facilitate, or how I facilitated his character study in cinema, I'm going to give you guys a brief lecture, or a lecture within a lecture, regarding character conception and design for screen media or for motion pictures. And then we go for the meat of the lecture, which is the Lapu-Lapu in cinema. And lastly, I will conclude with possibilities. So Some of the parts, particularly section 1 and 2, will breeze through, and also section 3. So first, a mystery in history. In his opening statement, Dr. Rasul Muharis wrote in his critical introduction, In Search of Lapu-Lapu, in European historical records, Lapu-Lapu is invisible. No one of those who are involved in the Battle of Mactan and its surrounding events in 1521 and left behind a written record actually saw him, knew what he looked like, heard him speak. His recorded words of defiance and pride are all indirect reported speech, or mentioned that he was present in the battle that made him famous. It is starkly ironic that even as we approach the quinticentennial of this famous battle, preciously little is known about a key figure in what has been enshrined as a world event. And one has acquired the status of a national hero. So in search of the historical Lapu-Lapu, therefore, the challenge is that of finding one's way between the void of facts and imagination's excess. So again, Professor Rasul Muharis wrote this as his opening statement for In Search of Lapu-Lapu, a critical introduction to the book Lapu-Lapu, the Conqueror of Magellan. So as we will experience, or as we will explore through this lecture, from the cinematic examples that I have prepared, we will indeed navigate between the void of facts and the excessive imaginations of Lapu-Lapu by many, many people. So, but before we get to that, I would like to first share some recent findings from Dr. Danilo Madrid Gerona, who is a Filipino scholar who specializes in Ferdinand Magellan, who studied the man's life and career and who has had access to the Spanish archives to focus on that specific studies. And the results of his research, he published in a book in last 2016 in Ferdinand Magellan, the Armada de Maluco and the European Discovery of the Philippines. So here's some key facts that he shared, and he's continuing sharing through numerous lectures, especially for this very special year of the quintencentennial. So first, based on primary accounts and testimonies obtained by Portuguese chronicler Gaspar Correa, who actually went on expedition to the Philippines 4 years after the death of Magellan, Lapu-Lapu was described as a viejo, which is the Spanish term for people who are 60 years and above. So like a senior citizen, okay, a viejo. So as an old person or as a senior citizen, as a viejo, Lapu-Lapu would have been even be exempted from the work and taxes imposed by Spain from its colonies. Accounts from Correa showed that Lapu-Lapu recognized the authority of the Spanish crown through Magellan and even agreed to pay tribute. But the trouble was the relationship between him and Magellan soured when Magellan coerced Lapu-Lapu to pay respect and tribute to Magellan's anointed supreme chieftain, Raja Humabon of Cebu, by kissing the latter's hand. Lapu-Lapu wouldn't do so, and thus Magellan sent troops to attack the chieftain's realm in Mactan, burning houses there. So basically, the colonizers under Magellan launched a full battle to subdue Lapu-Lapu and his allies to force them to respect the authority established for Raja Humabon. So for those who are interested, Dr. Green's discussion on Magellan and the Battle of Mactan is actually available on YouTube. It's for the international seminar Malgajes, Magallanes, Magellan in Philippine History that he delivered last December 2019. So it's actually very easy to find on YouTube, and these are the points that he discussed there. Another interesting fact that he also shared through the lecture is that Humabon and Lapu-Lapu are actually in-laws. Humabon married Lapu-Lapu's sister, but has turned her over from the favored wife position for a younger wife. So that caused bad blood between the two men and also other instances. So very interesting recent findings thanks to the research of Dr. Danilo Gerona. So subject to invention and reinvention through oral traditions, popular histories, and nationalization, with historians participating in the myth-making. When Lapu-Lapu's hero status rose as early as in the 1950s, especially 1970s, he's been credited to be the founder of Arnis, especially of the Panikamot, or the hand style of Arnis, bringing it to Cebu from when he learned it from Borneo. Lapu-Lapu essentially has transformed into a hero of legendary status rather than a hero who's a historical figure. So we will explore this characterization and the continued mythification of this person through cinema, as well as probable influences from other imaginary forms in other media. So let's first start with literary Lapu-Lapu. To begin, let's look at Lapu-Lapu ang Nakabuntog kang Magellan, 1938, written by Vicente Cullias. So this self-published novella or novel was a biography of Lapu-Lapu that was targeted towards young Cebuano readers at the time to instill the values of culture, identity, self-government, and nationalism. So published by USC currently in 2018, this English translation by Dr. Linda K. Alburo, who was a former USC Cebuano Study Center director, contains an insightful critical introduction In Search of Lapu-Lapu by our own national artist for literature, Professor Ressel Mujares. This book is part of a special series by USC Press, which is called Pangatagbo, 1521 to 2021, that investigates encounters of the colonizers and the colonized. Copies are available for purchase at the USC Press. So get one. Dr. Mujares' critical introduction is actually 1/3 of the book. So it's a very seminal essay, and you get a lot of insight from there. So the only extant copy of Lapu-Lapu ang Nakabuntog kang Magellan, that's from 1938 in Cebuano, is in a special and secured archive within the Filipiniana wing of the National Library of the Philippines. Dr. Alburo's great English translation of said book was based on a photocopy of that book, of that 1938 book that is kept in the National Library. So if you're interested to read the original text of Lapu-Lapu Nakabuntog kang Magellan by Vicente Cullias, you can, request it from the USC Cebuano Center for your research. So here are some excerpts from the book as published last 2018. So in the introduction, or a few words by Vicente Cullias, he writes, "The strongest among Filipinos of old was Lapu-Lapu, who defeated and killed Magellan. Because of his strength and keen mind, he is sometimes called Charlemagne in history and local stories. Because of his strength, his skill in swimming, wrestling, and boxing, he is also called the Philippine Tarzan." And actually, the book contains many accounts of Lapu-Lapu fighting with sharks, lions, gorillas. It's been noted that Vicente Cullias was trying to attract young readers who, at the time, in the 1930s, who might be more engaged or attracted to reading Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan books and stories. That's becoming more popular during the time, especially in the that period in the late 1930s, from 1935 to 1940. Okay, another section called "The Brave Boy." The boy, who is Lapu-Lapu at 11, then went down and sped to the shore. The Spanish visitor, who saw how fast Lapu-Lapu ran, how well formed the boy's arms and legs were, was surprised and said in admiration, "A good-looking boy, fast and strong. He has a future. He's the only boy I've seen that's intelligent and forceful." So that's the actual text translated from the book. Okay, here's some more. I'm going to focus on the second part. Lapu-Lapu and his age in captivity. So Lapu-Lapu here is now a younger man. He's now a warrior leading his own team or squad. So Dado, who's one of his brothers in battle, Dado interrupted, saying that Lapu-Lapu was not defiant nor oppressive, but fair to all and friendly to anyone. But he could also make the braggart and proud kiss the earth. But as quick as lightning and like a cat ready to bite, Lapu-Lapu sprang between them, Dado behind him, and faced the show off. I am Lapu-Lapu, Lapu-Lapu said in a voice to be respected. And then lastly, another description, this time Lapu-Lapu is now a dato. He's married to his wife, Bulakna. They had children. Their eldest is around 15 years old. What made the chief's family happier was due to the parents' happy disposition and youthful looks and movements. Though Lapu-Lapu was now 35 and Bulakna was 34, the children's mother was even more good-looking and beautiful now. The father was stronger and more adept at ruling his village. So Gullias's treatment of Lapu-Lapu, his characterization is quite romanticized, quite sentimental. He's basically portraying Lapu-Lapu as a positive role model, especially for young Cebuanos to emulate. Now, a more recent publication, The Visayan, 2014, by attorney Sofronio B. Orsal. So this book blended facts and popular lore about Lapu-Lapu. The Cebuano lawyer and former Commission on Audit Commissioner Orsal wrote this historical fiction on the life of the Visayan hero Lapu-Lapu. Okay, similar to Vicente Gullias, attorney Sofronio Orsal authored, then self-published this book in 2014 as an entertaining and engaging tool to reach the youth of today's generation and have them be conscious of their pre-colonial past and the dauntless and heroic feats of the people of in pre-colonial ancient times. I personally found this book more grounded compared to Gullias' Conqueror of Magellan, in which it shared more slices of pre-colonial tribal life that's based on historical fact. Especially, I like to note Orsal's bibliography is really an extensive list of resources and references on Cebuano and regional history. It is the bibliography is a testament of Ursal's dedicated research and impetus for authenticity. Having said that, there are still passages, many passages in the book that goes along like this. So in chapter 5, Arnis student, you have a fine-looking boy, my datu, Mang Taunas observed while watching Lapu-Lapu closely. He has a good height and quite well built for his age. Leave him to me. I shall make him the best that he can be. Okay, so that's from chapter 5, Arnis student, when Lapu-Lapu at some preteen age is learning to Arnis from a legendary master of the martial arts. And then in chapter 7, marriage, it reads, that's his actual text from this book. It was Lapu-Lapu, a tall, well-built man, his shoulder-length hair flying in the wind, with a red pudong or headband to keep his hair off his handsome tanned face. As he came closer, the giggling women loom weavers looked on, his naked, muscular upper body, the familiar chest tattoo with the symbol of the sun at the center, and the baybayin Lapu tattooed on his left and right upper arms. So he has Lapu on one shoulder and Lapu on the other shoulder. So Lapu-Lapu. So again, it's historical fiction. Let's read the last section from chapter 17, reconciliation. Although he was only 5 years older than Lapu-Lapu, the Raha, who is Humabon, looked much more aged, having grown fat and flabby from indolent living. In contrast, Lapu-Lapu's constant practice of combat arnis and other forms of martial arts, coupled with his frequent outdoor activities such as spear fishing and wildlife hunting, result in a well-sculptured, muscular body with strong arms and legs and formidable pectoral abdominal muscles. So that is Sofronio B. Orsal's text the Visayan. Okay, it's also note it was also written originally in English. Okay, available in most bookstores, and you can also find it at the Cebu City Public Library. So, having checked out the literary Lapu-Lapu, we will now go through how Lapu-Lapu, his form, his image gets visualized or envisioned by many artists. Among them, have earned the prestige, honor of being considered as national artist of the Philippines. So we'll breeze through this in a bit. So first off, we have here a statue that was erected in 1933 for the Opon Town Plaza. Here it's depicted here him with Lapu-Lapu with a bow and arrow, and it was facing Municipal Hall. Now, after three mayors consecutively died, I think in term, they decided to replace the statue of Lapu-Lapu instead of having the bow and arrow, but with his what's called his alhos or his pestle, which is actually based on local lore and legend that Lapu-Lapu had this magic pestle that he used to slay Magellan with. Okay, so in 1933, these were the two statues during Opontan Plaza. These were actually from the book Glimpses of Old Cebu, images of the colonial area, and it was in Lapu-Lapu, the conqueror of Magellan. All right, so here we have in Filipino comics, three covers featuring serialized comics by renowned national artist for visual arts, Francisco V. Coching. These were serialized in the years 1953 to 1954. Here's a cover. Here in the middle, you will see one of key art by Francisco V. Coching. You see Lapu-Lapu there, muscular fighting also with Magellan, who appears first and well coordinated. So these were serialized by Atlas Publications Filipino Comics from 1953 to 1954. The comics themselves were so popular. Here we have another cover featuring Lapu-Lapu and his main love interest, Princess Mihera. Okay, this I think was the last cover. This comic was so popular, despite its 1 year serialization, that it was immediately adapted into a film by director Lamberto Avellana with LVN Pictures, starring Mario Montenegro, his second lead in a film after playing the Gohoy in a previous picture, and with the renowned star Delia Razon. As you can see, Delia Razon had first billing because she's the more popular star, while Mario Montenegro was still a relatively fresh face in Philippine cinema at the time. But he has the lead titular role. We will get to Lapu-Lapu 1955, Lamberto Avellana's Lapu-Lapu in a bit. Here we have the bust of Lapu-Lapu, which was sculpted by national artist for culture, Guillermo del Tolentino in 1954. I have not, this is actually in the National Museum of the Philippines. I didn't, was able to find any information what was the inspiration or who was the basis of the bust, but I do suspect, and I'm willing to stand corrected, that the bust kind of looks like an older version of the star Mario Montenegro, who played the lead in Lamberto Avellana's 1955 film Lapu-Lapu. So we will actually see a young picture of Mario Montenegro, and there can be seen some similarities there. Here we have a watercolor of Battle Mactan 1964 by another national artist for visual arts, Carlo V. Francisco. Here, clearly you can see who is Magellan. And on the other side, we have two figures. It's hard to determine who is Lapu-Lapu, but we can assume one is Lapu-Lapu. But here we can see another depiction of a Filipino warrior. Possibly Lapu-Lapu would be the one holding the kampilan, the one with the sort of like the armoring, the one who's not holding a shield, because the kampilan is noted to be Lapu-Lapu's sword. So as you can see, the figure who's holding the sword, the kampilan sword up and about to strike Magellan, can be sort of inferred to be the one to be figure Lapu as Lapu-Lapu because he's also closer to Magellan, right? That photo was actually taken by the World History Archive. And here we have the mural that is located at the Mactan Shrine in Punta Engaño in Mactan Island. So here we can see again Lapu-Lapu holding the kampilan and it's about to strike down. We can assume to be Magellan as he shows his sword in battle. And now also in the same location, we find the statue of Lapu-Lapu, which has an interesting history. According to our very own Sir Jobers Persales, he wrote an article, Much Ado Over Lapu-Lapu statue last September 2019, where he said that this statue actually replaced an older statue made of metal frame and concrete that was erected in 1977 or 79. During that 1979 statue was set up because of the first celebration of the Bahug-Bahug sa Mactan, which is now known as the Kadaugan sa Mactan. And then a year later, the first lady Imelda Marcos visited the shrine. She didn't like the statue and had it replaced with this statue in sometime in April 1981. So this version is also made of concrete and has a metal frame built inside it, but it's also now gilded, as you can see. So so that's the interesting history about this statue. It's roughly around 30 years of age, or so 39 years of age, and it's been set up by then First Lady Imelda Marcos. So this was in 1981. Here we can see Lapu-Lapu. For those who can still remember that we used to have 1 centavo, 1 centimo coins as early as 1977. So here we have the visage of Lapu-Lapu on one side, and in 1987 there's another coin now replacing that, like the square coin with a more circular coin in 1987. As you can see, there seems to be some similarities to the cover that's been established by, drawn by Francisco V. Conching. There might be some influence to that. It's not too much of a far of a stretch to think so. Here now we have the statue of the Sentinel of Freedom based on Lapu-Lapu. A monument of Lapu. This is located at the Rizal Park, specifically at the center of Agrifina Circle. This has been designed by the sculptor Juan Sahid Imao. In 2004, the late Congressman Raul Del Mar and Congresswoman Nerissa Corazon Sun Ruiz initiated the installation of the statue in Rizal Park for him to be recognized as a national hero, and I think more importantly, to be recognized as the first Filipino hero to resist and seek independence from colonization. The proposed installation was opposed by the National Historical Institute on the basis that only statues of heroes of the Philippine Revolution in the 1890s should be standing in the Agrifina Circle of Rizal Park. However, still, because of funding from the Korean Freedom League, as well as backing of then President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, the statue was greenlit and it was unveiled in February 2004. And for those who might be interested, this is a self-published comic by independent freelance artist Tepay Pascual, Mactan 1521. And you can see here it's drawn in the more Japanese anime style, rather than compared to the Western styles of Francisco V. Conching in his serial Lapu-Lapu in the 1950s. So this Mactan 1521, self-published in 2014 by Tepay Pascual. So in last December 2019, when Dr. Gerona discussed Magellan and the Battle of Mactan before the Portuguese and Filipino scholars who were attending the seminar, the international seminar, Magallanes, Magellan, Philippine History, in December 2019 in Lisbon, Portugal, he actually presented this artwork that he commissioned from a graphic artist of what he thinks Magellan would have looked like based on his findings on the records of Gaspar Correa, the Portuguese chronicler who had done extensive documentation regarding the Battle of Mactan, the death of Magellan, and so on. So this is an artist depiction of Dr. Garona's ideas of how Lapu-Lapu might have looked like back then at 70 years old or so. So furthermore, based on the same Dr. Garona's findings about Lapu-Lapu's likely age, most likely age when Magellan arrived in the Philippines and took part in the Battle of Mactan, the National Historical Commission of the Philippines recruited artist Carlo Akbay in 2019 to come up with a photorealistic portrait of Lapu-Lapu, which was unveiled last year in May 2020. So here we have a portrait commissioned by the National Historical Commission showing Mactan as he might have looked like, or especially in terms of age, when Magellan arrived to the Philippines. As you can see in this next image of the commemorative 5,000 peso bill, here we have Lapu-Lapu. There is indeed some similarities to the photorealistic painting produced by Kakbay in terms of the tattoos, the hair, the large earring, and also some facial features similar to here you can see in the previous painting that he provided. Also, as you can see that the statue at the Punta Engaño, at the Mactan Shrine at Punta Engaño, is also in the commemorative silver medal. So that's the figure that's now existing for celebration of the quintencentennial. Now, so that is Lapu-Lapu and his avatars of art. Now, before we get into the discussion regarding Lapu-Lapu in cinema, I just want to go quickly through character conception and design. I've taught screenwriting for going on 9 years now at the BFA program in cinema at the School of Architecture, Fine Arts, and Design. And in coming up with characters for screenplays, I teach my students, I subscribe to Lajos Egri's Art of Dramatic Writing. Lajos Egri is a Hungarian-American dramatist and playwright. And then in 1960, he wrote a book, The Art of Dramatic Writing, which is basically a classic guide to writing plays, but he has principles and ideas that resonate even through screenplays and through for film. So in his second chapter on character, especially within the first section on bone structure, the bone structure of character, he says that every object has 3 dimensions: depth, height, and width. Human beings have additional 3 dimensions, which is physiology, sociology, psychology. So without a knowledge of these 3 dimensions, we cannot appraise a human being. So I essentially teach my students that in designing a character, you have to come up with a character's physiology, which is basically the physical appearance, also including the clothes she wears, how she wears her hair, whether it's long, her race, her ethnicity, whether she looks more like a boy or he looks like more of a girl. So those physiology aspects have to be noted down and written in a character profile. So along with that, I also discuss regarding sociology. Sociology is, as defined by Egri, is your character's social environment. Is your character born poor? Is your character born rich? Is she an orphan? Is she taken care by relatives and so forth? A person's social environment influences a character, especially in terms of psychology, which is the third component, the psychology of the character. So taking into account your character's physiology, how he or she built, and not in terms of anatomy, in terms of how is she thin, scrawny, fat, is she athletic, non-athletic, does she have friends, is she popular, is she a wallflower? Those things factor in or impact the character's psychology. So as you can see here, this visualization where you can see I made this as a visual to remind my students that there is indeed positive sociology and negative sociology. And then there's also positive physiology. You can have a character who's crippled, disabled, or who has been wounded physically, that has traumatized her. And that can bring on negative psychology, being more, more, not to say introverted is a negative psychology, but again, to be more withdrawn, to be more secluded, or to be more distrustful. And so psychology is about emotions, attitudes, perspectives. It's more about the beliefs. Well, sociology can also include the school loyalty, religion, and so forth. And physiology is basically the physical appearance and body, the one that you see, whether the character may have scars or she has a weird sense of fashion, and so on. Now, I also subscribe to The Art of Character, which is a book by David Corbett. And then in this book, David Corbett identifies cornerstones of dramatic characterization for immediate visualization and engagement. These cornerstones, if you consider them and develop them for your character, makes your character immediately engaging in terms of drama. Okay, so basically you have to have these cornerstones to make your character dramatic. So according to David Corbett, these cornerstones are having your character have a specific and explicit desire or goal, having a character flaw or vulnerability that she may keep secret, or it would maybe more obvious, and then also having a character contradiction. So a contradiction. So what are these desire and goals, flaw and vulnerability and contradictions are, and how do we get them? So I also advise and teach my students to make your dramatic characterization very organic. These three cornerstones must stem or come from what you have developed in your character profile in terms of the character's physiology, the character's psychology, and the character's sociology. So I also drew up this sort of another image, another sort of like illustration to show the relationship of these dramatic angles and aspects to the character dimensions. So as you can see, that desired goal comes from the angle of from the character's physiology and the character's psychology. So having your character having a character with a desire or goal makes the character more relatable and admirable. Common goals would be, trying to be more attractive or trying to feel better about oneself. So these are coming from your character's psychology and physiology. Flaws and vulnerabilities, they stem from a character's physiology, especially negative physiology, and then also sociology, and it could be positive or negative. Of course, as the poet of enlightenment, Alexander Pope once said, "To err is human, to forgive divine." Focus on the err is human. So having your character having a flaw and vulnerability makes your character human. So it humanizes your character. So it's important to have a flaw and vulnerability, and how that gets explored in the plot of your story, as well as hopefully overcome if you're going to have a happy ending, or how it might destroy your character, the flaw, destroying the character. Thus, you have your tragedy. And lastly, the contradiction or the quirk stemming from your character psychology as well as your character sociology. So these contradictions and quirk, you have to have them because it makes the characters memorable, makes them stand out as individuals, making them unique. So one of my favorite quirks, movie quirks for a character is if you know Indiana Jones by Harrison Ford from the Indiana Jones movie series. He is physically a strong, athletic, built man. Psychology, he's fearless. He's basically essentially fearless when he's dedicated to completing a mission or in that regard. However, he has this phobia for snakes, even the non-poisonous ones. So that makes him stand out. It can be considered as a flaw and vulnerability, but it does not really derail him so much because he can overcome it. But it's an interesting contradiction or quirk for this very macho man to be fearful of even looking at a snake, right? So these dramatic angles and aspects, as well as the dimensions of sociology, we will be exploring as our criteria for Lapu-Lapu's character study. So now let's go to Lapu-Lapu in cinema. So first, we have Lapu-Lapu 1955 by Lamberto Avellana, produced under LBN Pictures. Lamberto Avellana, as some of you may know, is the national artist for theater and film. Many have said that this is one of Lamberto Avellana's great works, but other critics would say this is only a precursor to his true masterpiece, which is his next film after Lapu-Lapu, which is Bajau. So to sort of do the character study of Lapu-Lapu, we will be viewing some 5-minute clips I've taken from key essential parts of each film's dramatic structure, particularly the opening, where it's the exposition, where it more or less establishes the protagonist, in this case Lapu-Lapu, and then some scenes in between, but also just as important is the denouement, or the conclusion. How does the film end, and how is Lapu-Lapu depicted in the film end? So to begin, here's a 5-minute opening clip of Lapu-Lapu by Lamberto Avellana. Oh, sorry. Okay.
From the faraway land of the conquistadores, 3 ships scoured the Orient Sea in search of spices and gold. Concepcion, Victoria, and Trinidad. Little did these voyagers know that their uncharted travels would bring them to the shores of Mactan, ruled by a native chieftain, the valiant, fearless. Lapu-Lapu had just come back from hunting, but instead of the busy town that he had left a few days before, Lapu-Lapu now found his people in mourning. Seeing the sorrow of his sister, Lapu-Lapu knew even before he was told, their ailing father had passed away. And now his kingdom felt his loss, shed bitter tears, sang dirges and songs, so that the spirit of their leader would find peace and happiness in the world beyond. Lacan had been a wise and brave man. He it was that taught his subjects the love of their own land, their own home. He taught them that only they have a right to live, who are not afraid. He had left them the legacy of freedom. And now, nothing could be heard but the wails of the orphan and the desolate subjects of...
Okay, so that is the exposition of Lapu-Lapu. As you can see here from the narrator, the narrator stated that Lapu-Lapu's father, Talakan, which what the Luzon called the Datu, left him a legacy of freedom, not only him but to his people. And actually later on, Lapu-Lapu made a promise, a vow over his father's ashes that he will fight against anyone who would impugn on those freedoms that his father has given to him and his people. Okay, so let's go in terms of character study, in terms of physiology. So here we have Lapu-Lapu as characterized by then young actor Mario Montenegro. It's not clear because of the black and white, but he's actually slightly brown as compared to like being dark brown or being bleached brown by the sun. But he's handsome, fit, tall. So again, the idealized version of Lapu-Lapu, and this was again based on the serial comics of Francisco Botong that was serialized in Atlas Publications Filipino Comics. So he's also an adept hunter, an accomplished fighter. Later, he would have many matches against foreigners, Chinese warriors. There's a scene in the film that he would almost fight hand while Chinese warrior would be doing essentially kung fu, but they're like more like an even match. And then when his beloved captured by a Chinese suitor and almost brought to the Chinese junk to be carried away, perhaps back to China, Lapu-Lapu swam after them and even fought his Chinese rival suitor, underwater. So the film is also notable for its great technical competence in doing underwater cinematography for those fight scenes, but they were actually very brief as well. In terms of sociology, so in the film, Lacan has a younger sister, Yumina, which is again based on the comics. He dotes on her, heeds her advice. but then because of their father passing, he now strives to be more of a authoritative father figure, especially when Yumina was infatuated with a Spanish sailor named Pedro, played by the actor Victor Silos. Um, uh, of course, Lapu-Lapu forbade it. So there was a side story in the film of Yumina and her love Pedro having a sort of a Romeo and Juliet kind of plot going on until Pedro proved himself to be more allied to the natives rather than to his fellow countrymen, thus winning the heart of Yumina and the grudging respect of Lapu-Lapu. In regards to his treatment of his love interest, Princess Miraha, who is the daughter of a neighboring tribe, the Lakan of a neighboring tribe, he is gallant and yet not to the point of being chauvinistic to Miraha. He is mostly assertive, aggressive to the men in the film, even with his subordinates, even with those who he considers brothers in battle. He challenges them with questions. He starts to like test their intelligence. He provides them, gives them riddles. He more friendly or softer treatment of women. This may be because that he is trying to prove himself, perhaps worthy of his inherited role, because he was formerly a prince and hunter, and now at the start of the film, when his father passed away, he's now the Lakan, the leader warriors people. He needs to perhaps constantly exude strength and intelligence, especially to men that he would encounter or work with, as the Lakan. Okay. So in terms of psychology, the film depicts, and again, this is perhaps most likely based from the original comics, to be Lapu-Lapu to be intelligent and cunning, which is, and again, it's for my observation, and you're welcome to watch the film. I'll provide information where you can watch the film later on. You only have until April though. But his intelligent cunning needs to be spurred by his distrust and suspicion, especially against foreigners, especially against the Spaniards who have arrived. So while as other tribes were saying that Spaniards or they were arriving for trade or wanting to share Christianity, Lacan was suspicious to the point that he had his right-hand man, seen here, bribe a Spanish soldier with pearls so that he could get the man's or the soldier's armor and bring it to Lapu-Lapu. Lapu-Lapu studies the armor, and then he has his smiths, his weaponsmiths, to create blades, arrow tips, swords with heavy edges that can cleave through the armor, the Spanish armor, because he is suspicious and he believes that Spaniards are not truly what they appear or present themselves to be. So, and then there's a later montage, a training montage that was shot at night at a beach where Lapu-Lapu and his warriors of his tribe, they trained in a sort of an arnis, but more of a dance where they were taught by Lapu-Lapu to target lethal blows on the areas that are not covered on a Spanish soldier. So basically, those gaps in the shoulders, the neck, that's not protected by armor, in preparation for battle. So I could almost say that he does have a sort of like a Machiavellian mentality. If you are familiar with Nicholas Machiavelli and his book The Prince, somehow there seems to be some similarities between that text and the treatment of Lapu-Lapu in his film in terms of his mentality, intelligence, and psychology. So in terms of Lapu-Lapu's dramatic aspects, so his goal is explicitly to rule like his father and to basically to protect the legacy of freedom provided by his father to their people. So he explicitly said that through a vow that was actually it was supposed to be in the film clip, but apparently it's not. He's living up. He's even though his father passed away, he seems to be presently living under his father's shadow by emulating his father and wanting to be like his father. So that could also be part of his flaw, that apparent zeal to his father's ideals, which includes the distrust of foreigners, and that distrust of foreigners carries over to the distrust of fellow tribespeople, like for example, Princess Maraha, whose father, in seeking peace, wants to trade with the Spaniards. You know, they had an argument, a sort of argument regarding that. He becomes more suspicious of Miraha's affections for him, and so on. So his contradiction, the one that somehow makes him unique, I think, is him being a grandstanding bully or grandstander bully. A grandstander bully is an archetype. It comes from the book King Warrior, Magician Lover by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. They are scholar students of Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And they looked at these constant four male archetypes in world literature, world mythology: king, warrior, magician, and lover. And not only that, they looked at the shadow archetypes, of the shadow forms of these archetypes. So the grandstander bully is the shadow form of the hero archetype, and it's described to be the bully who intends to impress others. Okay, so his strategies are designed to proclaim his superiority and his right to dominate those around him. This negative or shadow aspect of the hero is not a team player, so often taking leadership roles, but often inherited or otherwise bulldozing over others. He's the soldier who takes unnecessary risk in combat, and if he's in a position of leadership, he requires the same of his people or his men. So looking like that, looking as you see that Lapu-Lapu here, he looks like every bit the hero, the good hero, but in terms of his performance, in terms of how he deals with people disagreeing with him or people deciding to look into befriending the Spaniards, he kind of throws this, for lack of a better term, a tantrum. Okay, so which we'll see in this scene here.
Ano kaya titigilan? Totoong napakaselang na bagay ang nagbuntis sa aming magsadya dito. Sapagkat ang makasalalay ang kapayapaan ng iyong kahiyang at sampu ng ating mga kababayan. Lapu-Lapu, sa ngalan ng aming amang sila Kansula, ay inalo ka namin makiisa sa mga banyaga upang magbigay ng buwis sa kanilang hari. Dali alang-alang sa kapayapaan natin lahat. Prinsesa Mira. Ito ba nalalaman mo?
Ako'y sugo na aking ama.
Sa makatuwid, ay nais kong malaman ninyo lahat at nang ito'y makarating kay Lakansula na ako, si Lapu-Lapu, laka na magtas. Kailanman ay hindi sasangayon sa sino mang magbabayad ang buwis sa mga banyaga. Nakakamali ka, Lapu-Lapu. Nananalit ka lamang sa iyong sariling lakas. Ngunit papalo kami, ang ating mga tauhan at mga kababayan. Hindi ka ba naawa sa kanila? Ang mga dayon ay totoong napakalakas at higit na mainam ang kanilang sundata sa labanan. Sila'y malakas. Tayo mga kayong manghihigit na malakas. Nakakatayo mong mangusap, Lapu-Lapu, sapagkat matayo kang uri ng ating lahi. Tapos sa harap ng bangkay ng aking yumang ama, na kailanman ay walang maaaring lumabas tangan sa ating lahi hanggat ako nabubuhay. At walang maaaring yumapak sa ating pampang upang tayo iwan. Yan bang magiging kasagutan mo sa amin?
Ako'y nangangamba na iyong kapusukan at tigas na loob ay hahantong sa hindi mabuti.
Mira.
Kung ako'y talagang mahal mo, pinakikiusap ko sa iyong pagbigyan mo ang aming bana.
At kung hindi ako pumayag?
Kung hindi ka papayag ay kapwa na natin limutin ang pagbilog ng buwan.
Ngunit ang pagbilog ng buwan ay walang kinalaman sa aking paninindigan.
Ngunit sa akin ay meron. Aanhin ko pa ang maghintay ng pagbilog ng buwan. kung ang puso ko'y aandap-andap sa pag-aakalang baka ikaw ay masawi sa mga kamay ng mga dayuhan.
Tulong! Sumama ka sa kanila! Magpukay kayo sa mga banyaga! Magbayad kayo ng sa kanilang hari! Silang magkakamalit tumutong dito sa pulo ng magtaas! Masasawi sila! Mabibigo sila! Tulong! Lumayas kayo! At huwag na kayo babalik kailanman! Ipagpatuloy ang paggawa ng sandata! Tibayan pa ninyo!
Okay, so now let's go to the climax and denouement in Lapu-Lapu 1955. Lapu-Lapu does directly fight and slay Magellan, and then immediately goes to the denouement, where he gives an impassioned speech for the retreating Spaniards who flee the coast of Mactan Island onto their ship. And there's an interesting musical accompaniment, so I hope you can still hear it despite of the video clip's low volume. Okay.
Dalhin niyo ang takisan ng inyong pananako! Arribando! Sálvate que pueda! ¡Ayúdame, puede! ¡Vuelva todo! ¡Pronto! ¡Pronto! Ito'y maging babala sa inyong lahat! Na walang sino ang tayuhan ang maaaring sumalakay sa aming pampang nang hindi tatarak ang tugon sa kanilang kinatatayuan. Sasagpay namin kayo kahit sa aming mga dagat, sa aming mga bundok, ilog, sa aming mga gubat, kahit saan tayo mag-awot, ay maglalaban tayo. At ito'y itanim ninyo sa inyong mga isipan na habang merong nalalabing isang kayo mag-ibuhay, ay pagtatanggol niya ang aming kalayaan. Lamang kanino man!
So that's the denouement of Lapu-Lapu 1955. I think I would like to believe that perhaps the director Lamberto Alviano wanted to have the performance of Lapu-Lapu at the end to be more commanding, to be more fierce. But again, it's been impacted by the lead actors, perhaps youthfulness or inexperience as an actor. This is his second film where he takes on as lead. So something can be looked into that in terms of character as a study. So that is Lapu-Lapu 1955 by director Lamberto Avellana. Next, we have, so around 48 years later, we have Lapu-Lapu 2002. It is an entry to the Metro Manila Film Festival of that year. It had a production budget of 35 million pesos. It was rumored that it hired 3,000 extras for the film. It did not win the Metro Manila Film Fest, but in the succeeding year for the Film Academy of the Philippines Awards. It won 7 Film Academy Awards, for including Best Picture and Best Director for William Mayo and Best Actor for Lito Lapid. It was not shot in Cebu or Mactan Island. It was shot in Subic, Zambales. And then one special note, it did cast a lot of most notably the one who started as the queen of Visayan movies, Gloria Sevilla, in a special role as Lapu-Lapu's queen mother. So let's watch the opening sequence. It's roughly about 5 minutes lang. You should also like the opening credits.
Bibiyag ba tayo sa kanila?
Hindi. Naparito sila upang mamatay.
Actually, arrived from Cebu. Vic Vargas plays Humabon, and he's accompanied by another Datu Zula, who's played here by Roy Vinson, a fellow action star of and a contemporary of Lito Lapid. So here we have Datu Humabon, Raha Humabon, and Datu Zula.
Mga pagali ng Mactan! Sugatan kayo, no? Kasama ang aking amang si Dato Magan. Kaya hinihingi ko ngayon na masugatan kayo muli. Kasama ako.
Ano ginagawa nila? Naghahanda sila sa kamatayan nila.
So what actually follows is actually a longer sequence around 5 to 8 minutes of violent action, Lapu-Lapu cutting hands and heads of enemy warriors and so on. So we no need to go to that in detail. So that's exposition for Lapu-Lapu 2002. So let's look at the character study of Lapu-Lapu first with the 3 dimensions. So in terms of physiology, so he is more looking like the Malay warrior as compared to Mario Montenegro's depiction of Lapu-Lapu in 1955's Lapu-Lapu. Tattoos are present, so there's some tattoo artwork, henna artwork to depict some measure of pintado, but still is quite inaccurate. The fashion, the wardrobe, the costume of the character is possibly inaccurate based on the Boxer Codex. We Filipinos, though we may be spare, especially Pintados, we may be spare in what we wear. There's still have to very colorful, bright colors based on research, especially in the Boxer Codex. However, in consideration to Dr. Gerona's research of the likely age of Lapu-Lapu when Magellan arrived, here the actor playing Lapu-Lapu, Lito Lapid, is actually, I think, in his he was 47 or 48 years old, so much more closer perhaps to the findings of Dr. Gerona's in terms of Lapu-Lapu's actual age when Magellan arrived. Another interesting fact is 1955 was Lito Lapid's birth year, and it was the year where the first Lapu-Lapu film by Lamberto Villana was premiered. Sociology. So how does this Lapu-Lapu interacted with the others in the film? So he is foster father and brother to his closest aides, seen here depicted by Jeric Raval, who is a Cebuano. Here we have actually Mark Lapid, who's a real son of Lito Lapid, his eldest, and other characters. So they're close, they're brothers in arms, but he serves as foster father and brother to them. It's actually, there was an actual scene prior to the climax that them declaring that they consider him as both father and brother, and if he dies, they too will die. They will die with him. He shows great deference to his mother, played by Gloria Sevilla, as well as to his older sister, Miming, here played by Maria Isabel Lopez. What's also interesting in this film is that the screenwriter and the producer clearly have done the research in getting these actual names from oral traditions and popular history. Miming, according to oral tradition, popular history, is a sister, as the name of the sister of Lapu-Lapu, his wife Bulakna, and so on. So they must have done the research at the National Library, as well as may have been given information by the Visayan actors. It's one of the Visayan actors who took part, like Gloria Sevilla, as well as others. Okay. He's gallant and devoted to Bulakna, that's Bulakna, his love, and then he's later married his wife. Here's a picture of their honeymoon. He professed to uphold the value and respect of women. Very early on, there was a rape crime done in his village, which is somewhat inaccurate in terms of rape in pre-colonial times. We're not going to discuss the history about that, but the thing is, so they caught the rapist, and while passing judgment, he made a declaration or a reminder of the law that the women, especially of this village, are to be protected. They are to be respected. They're more than mere objects. They are partners, and so on and so forth. So there was a bit of a preaching going on there. He's a strong leader, but he seems to be delivering more of an eye for an eye justice. So strong and firm, a warrior's sort of like a warrior being among warriors. Now, in terms of psychology, there's not really much to go on to determine if there's any depths to this particular depiction of Lapu-Lapu. It seems to be straightforward. He says something and he does it. So he means what he says and says what he means. So not unlike in the Lapu-Lapu of Mario Montenegro in the film 1995 Lapu-Lapu, where he with his close aides he challenges IQ with riddles or debates with other people with other characters. Here, Lapu-Lapu makes a statement, and then he receives the feedback, and he doesn't give a response, and then he does an action. So even when in preparation for the Battle of Mactan, there was no scenes of him strategizing or giving into good thought how to prepare for the battle. There was a scene that he was just basically waxed philosophic about spirituality, which is again something interesting that we'll talk about in a bit. But he does show some instant cunning in the middle of battle scenes, especially in terms of counterattacking. Several sequences where you will think that he is trapped, he will somehow find a way out, or somehow if he gets ambushed by an enemy, he somehow turns the tables and ambushes the enemy back. Okay, so especially seen here, this part of his denouement. This is his final battle with Dato Zula, his rival, his enemy. Dato Zula ambushes Lapu-Lapu while Lapu-Lapu was hunting wildlife, a wild pig, to be served at his child's first birthday or something. And then, so Lapu-Lapu doesn't have his sword, but so, being resourceful and coming up with, where he uses the arrows and uses them to, stab his opponent repeatedly. So as you can see here. So in terms of Lapu-Lapu's dramatic aspects in the film, and we can get a clear idea, as I said before, no hidden deaths in terms of the character psychology. The way he's been portrayed or performed is basically, he means what he says what he means. So he basically said so many times to rule his people in peace, in prosperity, and to remain free. He says it in so many other words and also in Tagalog. The flaw could be his inflexibility and his sort of dogmatism, that though he may appear to be listening to others, he doesn't try to convince them otherwise, and basically he just sticks through his established vocalized dogma, like that. So go your own way, I'll do my way, kind of thing. So that could be a flaw, because considering that he's influential, he is indeed powerful. It could have shown that he could have done perhaps in the movie could done more using other gifts or talents aside from being a warrior, being a fighter, and so on. One interesting contradiction that I noted that in this depiction of Lapu-Lapu is surprisingly spiritual. If you recall in the exposition opening sequence, before he engaged in the battle, he and his warriors kneel down and receive the Baybaylan's blessing. And here's another sequence of him interacting with the young emerging warriors of tribe, going through what seems to be like spiritual training. So he's reminding them to always be honor their anitos, always seek their blessing, and it also gets repeated again in a small quiet scene with his closest brothers in arms prior to the Battle of Mactan, where he talks about how freedom is a gift of the anitos, and if they allow themselves to be subjugated by the Spaniards, they're just throwing the gift and basically dishonoring their anitos. So surprisingly spiritual take on Lapu-Lapu. Okay, so here we have the climax. I just want to show you how they depict it, similar to the 1955 Lamberto Villena film Lapu-Lapu. Here it continues looking at the oral tradition and the popular lore that it was Lapu-Lapu who killed Magellan. And here actually exhibits how the screenwriters and the director was familiar with the local lore, especially one that tells several legends, especially in Mactan, in Opon, how Lapu-Lapu slew Magellan with his alho or his magic pestle. So there is actually a tribute to that in this scene. in this sequence actually. So here we see Magellan being also a skillful warrior, turns, spots his true enemy, Lapu-Lapu, fighting, and then he turns to, and they engage.
Rahul Mabon. Nagagapi si Kapitan Magallanes. Tulungan natin sila.
Si Lapu-Lapu. Siya ang tunay na pinuno ng Mactan.
Kapitan! No podemos hacer nada. ¡Retire! 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 ¡Sube! ¡Sube! ¡Salto! ¡Altares! ¡Altares! ¡Altares!
Okay, so that's the climax. Now, what's interesting about Lapu-Lapu 2002 is denouement, where it actually explores or tries to visualize how like Lapu-Lapu died, his death. Okay, so in this fictional account, Lapu-Lapu was hunting with his brothers in arms. So basically, the Spaniards have left; they're gone. There's just like this newfound peace. Bulakna is pregnant with her firstborn. She's due any day now. And then so Lapu-Lapu decided to like go hunting, find a wild pig to like celebrate and for his wife and so on. So he goes out in story. He gets ambushed by Dadazula. Dadazula has more men this time, and it's just only Lapu-Lapu and his 4 other closest brothers in arms. They basically, as you've seen in the image before, Lapu-Lapu and Dadazula has a fight to the death with Lapu-Lapu winning, but he gets captured by Zula's men, who in revenge did this. Okay.
ayan. Ayan na. Lalabas na. Naku, ayan na. Lapo, lapo! Ayan na siya. Oo, kukunin kita.
So it's quite interesting that the filmmaker chose to end his film this way, perhaps thinking like a true hero should suffer a heroic death in order to be considered to be a hero. Also notable is the last scene belonging to here Gloria Sevilla, the queen of Visayan movies. So it could be a tributary nod to her stature as well as to her contributions to Visayan cinema and to like Visayan culture. So that's Lapu-Lapu 2002. Okay, just one more film to go. So we're not gonna show this, but in 2010, you maybe know about this, that the GMA network, they produced their own Lupang Hinirang national anthem video for their TV broadcast, which then was borrowed or lended to SM Cinemas for a time, for a year, to be used as their national anthem. So here we have the young actor Aljo Abernica playing a young Lapu-Lapu. So coming from Little Lapid, who was 47, older, now going back to a younger depiction of Lapu-Lapu. Also, for those who know about Mobile Legends Bang Bang, which is a popular multiplayer online battle arena game designed for mobile phones, this is where here they actually developed a character in 2017 based on Lapu-Lapu. So this is the Courageous Blade, Lapu-Lapu. So we'll just watch a bit of his intro video as he was debuted in 2017.
Welcome to the Mobile Legends Hero Introduction. Today we're debuting the Great Chief Lapu-Lapu. Hailing from the Macedon Island, the tribal chieftain Lapu-Lapu wields twin blades and can also transform these blades into a heavy sword. So
that is Lapu-Lapu Mobile Legends Bang Bang. He's actually a current favorite as well today, considering he was one of two characters developed geared towards Filipino audiences. The other is Paquito, the Heavenly Fist, who's based on Manny Pacquiao. For those who might know, there are about 100 million game accounts from the Philippines onto Mobile Legends. So not surprising why they develop such characters to appeal to such audiences. Now, the last film we're going to look at, and this you may have already heard about or seen this film, Elcano y Magellan, The First Voyage Around the World. This is a Spanish computer animated venture that retells the story of the 1519 circumnavigation led by the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan and the Spanish navigator Juan Sebastian Elcano, the namesake of the ship, the diplomatic ship that arrived just recently a week ago or somewhat a week ago. So released on July 5, 2019 during the 500th year anniversary of the launch of the Magellan expedition to Malacca. The movie, you may have heard, was very controversial, especially here in the Philippines, for its inaccurate portrayal of Filipino natives, especially of Lapu-Lapu. But I've seen the film, and to be fair, there were numerous inaccuracies and anachronisms. So there were numerous inaccurate portrayals, even of the Portuguese Magellan and so on. So very idealized, very romanticized, and at times the depiction, the performance is quite juvenile. So here from the official website is the image of Lapu-Lapu, or called in the movie Si Lapu-Lapu. So one of the names known Lapu-Lapu is known by. So in terms of his physiology, muscular, strong first, is designed to look like a really an imposing threat. Sociology, he is the enemy of Cebu, and he is the rule, and Lapu-Lapu is the ruler of Mactan. So here is a picture of the ruler of Cebu, who is known as Rey de Cebu. Okay, but I think maybe the producers and the filmmakers are familiar. Did their research perhaps? They looked up who was Humabon, and they got some pictures, and then they made the depiction of him. So you can contrast the two characters. One looks lethal, the other looks laid back, relaxed, right? Also, let's try to contrast his character to Magellan as how it was depicted in the animated film. So slightly more well-built, slightly muscular, the build of an adventurer, a friendly adventurer, but still Lapu-Lapu really posed more of a threat. Now, in terms of the characters' mentalities, Lapu-Lapu's presence in the animated film is very short and very small, very low screen presence. There's not enough evidence to really gauge how, in terms of psychology or mentality. So, but I'll show you the entire sequence that discusses Lapu-Lapu. He is first introduced by word of mouth, as reported by the native Cebu to Magellan and Elcano to be their enemy, and they ask Magellan's help to subdue their enemy. And then there's a scene where one of the sailors named Iago, who is actually a Portuguese spy sent to undermine Magellan's expedition, goes off and tries to make a deal with Lapu-Lapu so that to ambush Magellan as he arrives to fight him on Mactan Beach. So anyway, so in terms of goal, in that short sequence, it's clearly evident that invaders arrived, foreign invaders arrived, so they're in his home territory, so basic goal, repel and resist, all right? In terms of flaw, there's no apparent flaw featured by the character. He's just a guy minding his own business. These strangers came bearing weapons. He's just defending his home, so no apparent flaw. Contradiction, fashion conscious perhaps, you'll see in this coming sequence.
I hope that girl Samar comes quickly. We have no idea what he's saying.
Look, here they come. Hey, there she is.
Oh, my beautiful lady, my respects.
Samar! Huwag kang bumayan! Mercy Lapu-Lapu nako ubuki!
He says that the king of the neighboring island, Mactan, never pays him his tariffs. That king is a dangerous enemy to us, and he'd like to know if you would be willing to help us defeat them in battle.
Tell him that if he provides us with good helmsmen that can guide us to the Maluku Islands, we'll help him out.
And who do you suppose that guide will be?
I'm sure he'll be nothing less than a heartless pirate. Surely you're just joking around. After all, sir, I don't think that she could...
Shh, Elcano.
It'd be enough if you could just give us directions.
Well, here, men aren't the only ones who sail the oceans. I'll give you the directions you need. You can find that way, boy.
So here's Iago. Somehow he finds himself to Mactan Island.
No one's here. What's happening? Oh, I have necklaces, many jewels, mirrors, bracelets, pocket knives, earrings, pendants. Now, please, take it. Okay, so you don't like jewelry. Oh, you guys are naked. Do you want some clothes? Please don't hurt me. A pair of almost brand new shoes, some socks with pretty good ventilation, this lovely striped shirt, A pair of pants with the finest fabric in Spain. My skivvies?
Ooh, Sav, no. Skivvy!
Skivvies, you like them, huh? Well then, hear me out.
The time has finally come.
Everyone, to the boats!
Have all the men put on their armor just in case.
Be careful, men.
Follow me. Be on the lookout. Proceed with caution.
Something is going on here.
I don't like how quiet this place is. There's no one here.
Where do you think the natives are?
It's way too quiet to be calm.
We've been betrayed. Attack them. Fogo!
They were waiting to ambush us, Admiral.
Reload your blunderbusses, man.
I sure made a mess.
Fogo! Come on, we're getting back on the boats.
That's Magellan right there.
So you betrayed us.
Oh, talkie! Look, our men are retreating. We have to help them get back, or they'll never get out.
We're going back to the Concepcion.
Why didn't you keep your helmet on, Admiral?
My head is harder than a helmet. Oh no, Captain Serrano has fallen.
Admiral! On the boats, men! We have no choice but to flee!
Wait for our Admiral. Admiral!
Your time has come, Magellan.
You traitor!
You're gonna pay for that!
Hey, they're attacking us! Gather all the weapons you can find! All hands on deck! Hey, what do you think you're doing? I'll teach you! No one's breaking my ship!
Let's get out of here, or they'll eat us all alive.
But what'll happen to the Admiral?
There's nothing left to do. Let's cut our losses.
Hey, don't leave us!
Don't stop shooting! Fire!
Hey, you'll pay for that.
Hey, it's Samar! Hang in there, Admiral!
You must keep this safe, Senor Ancano. It's very important.
That's Samar!
You must hurry. We don't have time to spare.
Samar!
Jump in!
So that's a Cano and Magellan exposition and climax in one sequence. So that's basically the sequences that featured Lapu-Lapu. So to conclude the possibilities, where do we go from here, knowing that these are the depictions, the visual imagery that has been inspired or informed by this historical figure, but again, shrouded in mystery as well as myth, being made into a legendary character rather than an actual historical hero. So I like to also refer back to Professor Mijares' opening statement in his afterword in the book Lapu-Lapu, The Conqueror of Magellan. And he wrote, heroes are products of a people's imaginings and not just a set of historical verifiable facts. It does not mean that these facts are unimportant. It is only to say that a study of heroes must attend to how they are interpreted, understood, and imagined. So again, this is by Professor Russell Mijares. So how can we take that? The way I think that we should consider is that there is a need for an adequate or competent representation of Lapu-Lapu in motion picture media as well as or in the moving image arts. So Moharris's In Search of Lapu-Lapu, a critical introduction, is an ideal base, is an ideal base for a documentary or essay film. It's quite seminal, very insightful, very informative. It clearly tracks the development of the character of Lapu-Lapu from the void of facts, the void of the historical facts, as well as how he somehow remained in history, not only for just being considered to be a key part of the Battle Mactan, as well as the rumored or alleged slayer of Magellan, but how he grew in legend and myth. And I guess that's the same with most other heroes, especially those who have no proper historical documentation. Another Visayan hero who has a similar problem would be Pantaleon de Liegas, or known as Leon Kilat, the revolutionary hero who led the Tres de Abril revolution here in Cebu. A film project on Lapu-Lapu or the Balbatan based on the recent historical findings, especially of Dr. Gerona. He dedicated a chapter of his book Ferdinand Magellan that was published in 2014. He really discussed in depth the he found regarding Correa's chronicling of Lapu-Lapu and the Balmactan. And again, this is basically calls for a more practice of research-based approach to the arts, especially in cinema. I'll be first to admit, we in cinema, in the BFA Cinema program, we strongly guide our third-year students to employ research in coming up with concepts and ideas for their thesis film projects, as well as hoping that it'll be a recognized skill as well as good practice to continue when they graduate and pursue work in the professional field. I for one think that research is necessary. Research is especially in our industry, in the motion picture and arts here in the Philippines, is kind of undervalued because it's seen as a cost. It's seen as a cost item to engage in research. However, compared to in Hollywood, especially in other foreign independent cinemas, research is necessary. Development is necessary, so that even if it takes 2 to 3 years of research development for a concept, that time and work is needed so that it can be a quality concept that can bloom into a motion picture or a work of cinema that will be recognized and lauded. So heroes and heroines are essential to our development as individual human beings, as well as our collective development as communities and societies. So whether they are actual, mythical, or fictional, what is significant are the gains of such progressive role models or paradigms from whom we can learn to deliberate through difficult situations and act in spite of adversity. And progressive, I put it in quotes because it's a quality that I think is a result of an intensive and extensive process, a committed process that when we are perhaps adapting historical figures as heroes into cinema or film, that we should not, idealize them or romanticize them, or recognize that they had been idealized and romanticized ad infinitum. So as the one for like Vicente Gómez and of course Sofronio Orsal and others we observed and discussed in this lecture. So I'd like to end with everyone here trying to imagine that according to Dr. Gerona's findings, based on the chronicling of Gaspar Correa, that Lapu-Lapu was already entering his old age, his twilight years, when Magellan arrived in the Philippines. He's ready to join his gods. He's ready to join his loved ones in the life beyond this one, only to have a foreign force, to come and threaten their way of life, the life of his children and his grandchildren and his family and their friends and their people. So imagine that or imagine him as an old man, vulnerable, frail, still has some power, still some cannot join to battle. How would he go through that? What would what would he be scared about? What would he be worried about? What would concern him? And that what would be then will be his goals, and what will be also his contradiction. And I think if we try to imagine that, maybe, I think for me that would be a motion picture that we should watch, and it should be a motion picture project that we should see that we can make. So that's all, everyone. Thank you again for your kind attention. I know I've been going a bit long, so that's my lecture. For those who might want to reach me, here are my contact information. So that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Dennis, for that very informative lecture on the different representations of Lapu-Lapu through the years. No? Indeed, it's really nothing short of fascinating how someone who is very sporadically mentioned in the historical record, as you pointed out earlier in your lecture, has been able to inspire all these myths and depictions about him. So once again, thank you for that, Sir Dennis. And now that we're done with the lecture, it's time for Sir Dennis to answer some questions that were addressed to him. So because we're kind of pressed for time here, I'll just try to blend some of the questions that are of similar nature. So, Sir Dennis, this question is from one of the literature majors, Clarissa, which is kind of similar to the question I raised in the chat box. So what elements, this is because we will be taking up Lajos Egri in our creative writing class for the second half of the semester. So according to Egri, what makes screenwriting different from fiction writing, or what elements should we pay close attention to when we're sort of transitioning from like fiction writing to, say, dramatic or screenplay writing?
So the way I used the art of dramatic writing by Lajos Egri is it's basically geared towards writing for plays, for theater. So if you are a fiction writer, more accustomed to writing prose fiction, one key difference I learned from personal experience from prose fiction to, say, dramatic writing for the stage or for is that fiction you have narrative devices where you can get directly to the internal life of your character, especially for protagonist. Like you can immediately write down a protagonist's thoughts, and that will be read by your audiences or by readers. Whereas here, you can employ several tactics on stage, but these are mostly technical tactics that you can have. It's the same with film, where you can have voiceovers to serve as these expressions of thought, right? But you have to take note of these, these are technical techniques for the stage. So a playwright recognize that you can employ such similar devices, but you have to be aware that they're mostly technical. So there's also has to be like noted down when you're writing a play. But for the most part, like it's kind of like another way I also try to relate to my students the difference between let's say writing for the stage or the screen compared to writing in a novel or in a short story is that in novel, short story, it's all right to be more prone to tell rather than show. But for the stage and screen, you have to really show and tell, because when you're writing for prose, there's no intermediary. Your text gets instantly read by your readers, and then the words that you've written gets visualized or come alive in the readers' minds. Whereas here in the screen, and for the stage there is an intermediary. You have actors, you have a screen, you have so you have to uh, fiction writers who will be players have to recognize that you also have collaborators in terms of the actors who will have their own input in trying to understand and interpret the text of the dialogue of the character action that you've written, and try to in their way to internalize the text and then become the living embodiment of what you've written, especially the characters you've written. They will have to have their own input. So that's also one key difference that I think budding playwrights must understand, that you're not just instantly writing for your readers. You're writing for readers who will collaborate with you, readers who are actors, readers who are designers, readers who will produce music, because all of these other collaborators and their respective fields come also into picture. So actually, there's so many things that a fiction writer would need to learn and adapt, because it's two really different mediums. However, I personally think it's not much of a big learning curve. It's just a more of a, you have to dedicate some time and experience and really expose yourself to. I think it's like also helpful for fiction writers to take part in play, act in the play, and so forth, to really get a handle on what an actor would be concerned of in reading play and words that's aligned to how the original writer imagines it. But in regards to the book, Art of Dramatic Writing, so it's written in 1960, and a lot for me was learning from it. Charles, what I did, I was a little bit more flexible with it. I didn't really treat it like it's the Bible on dramatic writing or the Bible on playwriting. So there's some principles that Egri discussed that I find to be somewhat outdated. So I only sort of went through the book and found those principles and those practices that really resonated with me from my own personal experience. Because in college, I was also involved in theater, and also I always loved in film, and since forever I've always loved storytelling. So some of Egri's discussions rang true for me and consistent for me. So I found those more effective and more convenient for me to teach, because I really believed and backed them. So I was a bit more flexible and selective in finding the text. But though there's times when with students that I will discuss the text with themselves, because again, there's also that thing when you're teaching the text, that's something that you might understand it, but the students also might have a different understanding or comprehension of it, or there might be some text that you don't understand and they themselves get it. So it could also be helpful to schedule some sessions going through the text with them to see, the more the merrier, the more brains can help in understanding the text. But though I will grant that Laos Egri's text is not really that complicated or dense compared to other books on dramatic writing, it's very very practical in terms of its discussion regarding dramatic writing.
Okay, thank you for that, Sir Dennis. I think my students took note of that, and yeah, I'll take note of your points as well. So we have another question from Stephen Atenta. I think this kind of relates to Bea's earlier question on cultural relativism and universalism. So a number of the film clips that you showed to us, they use Tagalog to portray a Cebuano hero in the film. So we would like to get your thoughts on that. So is it should we use the language used at the time to be historically accurate, or should we use a common language to appeal to as many Filipinos as possible?
So in regards to, speaking from my own personal preferences, for me, though much negative has been said about Mel Gibson, but when in his last two films before his retirement, he made Apocalypto that's been delivered in a Aztec language, and then or Mayan language, and then he also had Passion of Christ delivered in the language of Aramaic, which was considered to be the language alleged to be the time that Jesus used. So I think there's something to that. For me, as a filmmaker and as well as a storyteller, I am astounded and appreciated for such like sort of like a effort to do so, and you know, considering that again that Lapu-Lapu is, you know, is Cebuano or Mactanon, and to some degree, yes, those Cebuano Bisaya would be an appropriate language for a story. I really do believe that. I really believe that there's this, I often tell my students that that authenticity is a rare quality to find in a creative work because of many factors. But it's kind of like for me the holy grail to being creative but still being authentic, using materials that are organic to the story concept you're developing. I think with the right story, with the right performance, with the right cinematic treatment of Lapu-Lapu, it doesn't really matter. It won't really matter much if the language was delivered in Cebuano. I think it should be delivered in Cebuano or maybe a more archaic form of Cebuano, so that it has that value of authenticity. And then I will still feel it will, if it's only well done and not used as a sort of like a tactic or a perhaps a what's that called, a sort of a like a cheap trick, but just to gain attention, but like most like a gimmick, using a Cebuano language for a Lapu-Lapu film should not be used as a gimmick. It's just basically staying true to the content, staying true to the character. Then film, as long as it's being well made and with that true intention of authenticity, it will be still well received. Much the same way where you would have you know, foreign films like South Korea's Parasite, which explores universal themes but somehow localized it in the class struggles within a South Korean suburb in the language of South Korea. It somehow resonated with Western audiences, even winning Best Picture. Not only that film, but many other films as well throughout cinema's 100-year history. Language is no barrier. In fact, for those who truly love cinema, for those who truly live for the cinema, it is more of what we seek for, because that's what cinema is. Cinema is experience, and cinema is experience much more like similar to reading books and reading literature, where you get to get out of yourself, out of your body, and just immerse yourself into another form. And in reading, you have to have a very exercised imagination to do that. But with cinema, you get aided because of all the elements of cinema. So yes, I think I understand. I understand the reasons why perhaps producers would think, especially like the producers of Lapu-Lapu's 2002 and Lapu-Lapu's 1995, think that using Tagalog, being, you know, the recognized national language in terms of Filipino, making most of the Filipino language, they say, as they allege, would be the way to go to reach many audiences. I personally disagree, since Bisaya or Cebuano has a similar sibling languages all across Southeast Asia, and you know, being a cultural artifact, cinema is supposed to enrich, so it's to build up. So it's like giving a gift. If we make a Cebuano, if more and more Filipinos enjoy films from the regions, learning and discovering new languages for them, for those who are maybe insulated in Metro Manila, and you know, by recognizing that they have more languages, more tongues in a mother country, just again to even simply highlight lang yun. Now, we are a multifaceted nation and peoples, and we should not just basically be like rigid and locked to one thing. We are in many ways lagi a rainbow of a culture and of a country, and that should be celebrated and and valued very much.
Okay, thank you for that, Sir Dennis. So we actually still have like a few more questions from mainly from my students, but we are quite pressed for time. Yeah. Anyways, if you
They
guys
can
have,
they can just reach me by if you want, Charles, you can send your students questions to me by email, and I'll
yeah,
try to
okay.
find time to respond to them.
All right. Thank you for that, Sir Dennis. So yeah, to show our deepest gratitude to you as our lecturer, we'd like to present to Sir Dennis the certificate of appreciation for taking the time to impart onto us what knowledge he's been able to research on Lapu-Lapu, a seminal figure in Cebu, in Cebuano, Philippine, and even world history. So allow me to once again read the text here. So the University of San Carlos Cebuano Study Center presents this certificate of appreciation to Dennis M. Hudilla for his lecture entitled Datu Lapu-Lapu, a cinematic character study during the Vicente Soto Lecture Series 2021, given this 27th day of March 2021 via Zoom, signed by Father Jesuraj Antoniapen, SVD, Vice President for Academic Affairs, and Dr. Hope Sabanpan Yu, Director of the Cebuano Study Center. So a warm round of applause, please, for Sir Dennis. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again, sir. So may I remind everyone one final time to fill out the evaluation form. The link is already available in the chat box, so you can avail of your certificate of participation for this event. So before we officially close this meeting, let me just take this time to announce our next speaker for April, Mr. Lawrence Lacambra Larry Ipil, acclaimed poet who's done Cebu proud on the international stage and the author of award-winning poetry collections, The Highest Hiding Place and Experiment of the Tropics. So yeah, that's Sir Larry Ipil. This one is scheduled for April 24, 2021, also a Saturday from 2 to 4 p.m. So for further updates on this installment, like the title of his lecture, and also other subsequent installments of this lecture series and other activities we at the center have planned, do check out the Cebuano Study Center page on Facebook. Okay, so we've officially reached the end of our program, but before I let everyone go, may I request everyone, or yeah, I think we can all be accommodated for a group photo. So kindly turn on your videos. So yeah, turn on your videos for a group photo. Clarissa, can you take care of taking the group photo? So you just tell us, Clarissa, when you'll take a picture.
Okay, so can I request the others to please switch on their cameras so that we can have a group photo. There are still about 6 people, I think, who haven't switched on their cameras yet. Okay, so I have 8 people whose cameras are on right now. So everyone, smile at 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's have that again. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, thank you
everyone.
Thank you, Sir Dennis.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you for that, Clarissa.
Thank you. Dr. Bea, thank you, Miss Bea.
Okay, so thank you once again, everyone, for attending this lecture. I hope we all had a fruitful afternoon, and may we all have a rest of the weekend. So once again, thank you, Sir Dennis, and everyone for attending. See you again in future installments of this lecture series. And this is your host, Charles Dominic Sanchez, signing out. Daghang salamat.